Thank you, Shahrokh. I had good training with my mother. They said that she was iron fist in a velvet glove. And I grew up helping her organize hundreds and hundreds of volunteer events. So I think what I did was I was well trained for how to ask nicely, but be very willful at the same time. So thanks for that introduction. And for everybody coming today, I know that it's that time of the quarter where there's a lot going on. And so I just wanted to, share with you some early work and some recent work and ask Shahrokh back up to talk about the project last summer and the way that's actually turning the direction of my own work. As I was taking the train down yesterday, I was thinking about, it's always this thing about how do you start? Like it's like the opening line of the book. And I was thinking about actually walking into this space, which makes me feel a little bit very 19th century in the way that I think we all occupy simultaneously like 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and we have a foot forward in the one that we're in and the one that's coming. And that the work that we're able to make is in many ways a product of the convergence of those, right now, what we call analog and digital technologies. But primarily work comes not because of the kind of confluence and edges of those technologies, but really thinking about how we pay attention, and that work is made out of an active attention about how something really seemingly simple is never so. And that's how, these videos were made. I don't draw, and I don't actually do a lot of writing. And so my attempt to tactilize those things has been to bring them into video. And so the drawing that you saw, going around the line, drawing itself and undrawing itself, drawing itself and undrawing itself, is my thinking about what drawing is and the form of attention that it creates for presence and being present and responsive to the thing that you're immediately within. And I think that's why I've been really attracted to and have worked for a long time making installations that kind of find their form as they meet architecture. But as I was taking the train down, I was also, of course, thinking it's such a great train ride as you course along the ocean, and thinking about that border and thinking about not just the geopolitical border of north-south, but the border that's between the liquidity of the water and the solid ground, and the churning edge that always is, and that edges are always conflicted or fraught places. And perhaps the most conflicted and fraught one is the one that's formed by the largest organ of our body, which is our skin, and that makes us an interior always in relationship to an exterior. And I think it's out of thinking about that border and that edge that the work really forms. Anne Carson has said that, and she's a poet that I really love. In fact, she has a new book out, if anybody has seen it. It's a really very beautiful book that's a tribute to her brother. And she says that, all contact is crisis. To touch is always to be touched and returned. And so to touch is to be tampered with, to change, to displace, to call into question, to set something into motion. And it's of all the senses, taste and touch are the two senses that actually require contact. All other kind of perceptions happen in some form or another at a distance. And so the proximity and the distance of touch coming forward and releasing itself is made me think a lot about this edge of the water and the edge of the body. And I wanted to sort of use that as a way to structure thinking also about, the head attached to the lower body and everything that the neck does in terms of our inheritance of Descartes and this assumption often of them being two different embodied places. But to think also, it made me think about what I would show today as being works that have actually all occurred in places that have been at borders, mostly borders of the water to the land. And what happens in that space that actually can't quite be defined. That the shoreline is this place that's always shifting. When we went for dinner last night, we went down to the water and the tide was really high, and it's always kind of shocking how incredibly it's gnawing and gnashing and tearing, and how really violent an edge that is. And that it's never kind of the same twice. But these are all things that you know because you live here. But I live in Ohio, So there are things that are, always on the first arrival to the coast, kind of remarkable, even though I did live for a number of years in Santa Barbara, and I was told that it would not be possible to teach sculpture in Southern California unless I learned how to surf. So I don't know if you've learned how to surf yet, but I did at one point stand up. So I just wanted to start out really thinking then about the piece that was actually here years ago, which is my first experience of being in La Jolla, and thinking about the border not just between the land and the water, but between species, and between inside and outside, between those categories of contamination, what we consider clean and what we consider dirty, and how in many ways, it's like the role of the artist to be like the wrist, to take categories that are rigid and to attach them to a kind of flexibility of thought, which we conflate or associate to our hand, and to perhaps in the posing of the work, confuse those categories. So in this piece that leached basic iron oxide stained water from this table surface. This was installed at the museum here in La Jolla. And it is covered with a table of teeth that are from herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. And so there are animals and there are human teeth in here. And unless there's a lot of evidence of dental work, you don't always know whether something's animal or human in here. And it was interesting because as we were collecting these teeth, this would probably be a piece that would be impossible to now make because of the regulation on body parts. So it's kind of a crass way to say it. But I worked with vets in the area. I worked with we boiled heads down. We boiled jawbones down from the slaughterhouse. I worked with dental surgeons. I have a lot of dentists in my family. I got all of their friends to gather teeth for me. But we had to sit, we had to clean all of those teeth. And what was really interesting, especially when we were rendering these heads and trying to soften the bone enough to get the teeth out of the jawbone, which is really a much kind of tougher process, I was really aware how when you're just inside the body, it seems very clear and it's really fascinating and it's very matter of fact. And when you're outside the body, but when we were in this process, you had both the hair and the skin, and you also had the inside of the mouth and all of that flesh. And that was a very physically queasy kind of experience. And it made me think about not only is that a physical experience, but it's this way that we, inherit so often this need to place things in categories and for things to keep the neatness of their categories. And so this is one of the projects. This was made really thinking about the geographic border that this is. And this piece, which was made a couple of years later, is called Indigo Blue. That last piece was called Between Taxonomy and Communion. This piece was in Charleston, and it was also a border place. It was a place where it's on the water. It's in many ways, although it's southern, it still feels like it's a little bit, it's between north and south in many ways. And it was a project that was made responding to the history of Charleston and how that's marketed as a kind of form of tourism, and the particular slice of history that is marketed. And this was part of the Spoleto Festival, and the first time the visual artists were invited in to participate in that process. And I became very interested in the harvesting of indigo blue as the first cash crop in Charleston, and the confusion, the tensions, the haunting of the present that still exists by these economies that are born out of a slave economy, and how do those come forward historically, and how do they maybe haunt and inhabit the present? And I kind of turned to thinking about the relationship between the land and the water as one way to actually arrive at a text that I could bring forward into this relation. And so what you see here on the right is an erased book that actually is a military publication of the Navy, and it is an accounting of the relationship, the legal border between land and sea, and what the regulations are that determine the provenance of that shifting edge. And what happened during the piece is that the indigo dyed clothing, which is all work clothing, that was stacked up, and I'm going to show you a little bit of how that was made. These books were being erased, and they were being erased from the back to the front. So the mechanically printed text, which carries this kind of legal history, was being erased, and what was left was a trace or mark of the hand of the reader going through that process. And I really thought about that unmaking in relationship to the more gigantic making of the material strata and accumulation of the shirts. And they were laid a layer of pants and a shirt, one layer of pants and a shirt. So they were kind of laid as bodies, and this kind of action of the hand smoothing the cloth is something that I think of as being a felt presence that carries forward into what this physically becomes. The clothing that we used was all cotton, and the thing about cotton, it's really hard to find cotton work clothing now. It's all some sort of synthetic, but cotton carries temperature, and it also carries the kind of temperature, it carries the smell of the body in a very different way than a synthetic. And so I was thinking a lot about how can a material weight, can you feel something about a material weight of something through how it looks visually? I can feel it through how I make it, and think of this gesture as a kind of honoring of an absent history. But whether that's something that can come forward in this accumulation and be felt, I think was for me a question of the piece, and also whether this is just a juxtaposition to think about that unmaking of the eraser and the stylus, scrubbing away the printed word to leave a trace that's part saliva and part pink pearl eraser, relative to the making gesture of the hand. And so, my question, I think, for so much of this is, how does hand making make sense? How does it come forward in an economy now? How is it necessary to how we understand and make relationships? And how is it carried forward in the material processes? These books became the kind of artifact of the project. They're really beautiful. It's like I loved how different readers erased differently. And so it's kind of a diary of all the lifetime of the presence of this piece during the festival. Another kind of border location of a different kind, this was more of a seaport, but a place where cargo was coming in and being offloaded. This was a project that was done a number of years ago, and it's called A Round, as in a round of boxing or a round, a singing round. And is at the power plant in Toronto. Some of you might know that space. It was it formerly generated power for the industry of the site, which had now been repurposed and had become a site of kind of tourism and condominiums and redevelopment. And I was thinking about how, again, there's a kind of unmaking and making that's going on in this piece, and how the body itself, this is one of the first times the image of a body actually appears as a figure in the work, as a thing, not as a live presence. And so what you see here is hundreds of wrestling dummies that we stuffed with sawdust. Obviously, there's a lot of sawdust in Canada. And we piled it up so that it created this almost, this incredible silent space because it padded all of the walls. And what happened is the bodies absorbing all that sound created a space within which you could hear the very fine movement of the knitting needles that were sitting on a stool at the base of the pillars. And those knitting needles, I don't have the sound or video from this, but if you see back on the pillar there to the left, you can see something sticking out. There are two bladder balls that are those punching bags, and they were mechanized, and every once in a while they would go off, and they would hit the columns, and they would sort of beat at the building, and that sounded in there, but it contrasted with this sort of accumulative making, which was a circular knitting that was going on by hand, and was actually taking this horizon of thread, which is in the middle, which is all knitting yarn, and someone would stand up, they would undo that, they would return to their bench. And I was thinking about how it's this kind of balancing activity between something being made and something being unmade. And I guess my venturing, my optimism that making will in some ways eclipse the unmaking that we seem hell-bent on all the time. The thing that happened at the end of this is some of the sawdust was actually damp when we made these. And so they started to molder, and they started to smell, and they never actually fell off the wall, but they had a really more increasingly pungent organic life. And so it was like this inanimate thing had become animate in some way through that moisture. And this project was in 1999, and it was not literally on an edge, but it put me on an edge. No, this is a project that was in Venice at the Venice Biennial in 1999, and my experience of being in Venice and working there was to be continually stepping on and off the vaporettos, to be stepping from something solid to be stepping onto water, and the rhythm of that was, I think, something that got inside and actually patterned the way I thought a lot about this piece. I would say it is a complicated and a fraught honor to represent one's country in this context. And I thought a lot about the architectural history of this building, which you can see the pediment, and you can see that it looks like every bank in Iowa, and that it's very Jeffersonian. And so what it does is it carries, of course, all the authority of the state and the authority of systems of government. So when I was researching this project, went straight back into Jefferson. I went to visit Monticello, and kind of like the Indigo Blue piece, think about how do you bring forward into a kind of material making a historical absence, which is here at 1999 at that time, thinking about how do you go forward in the millennium when we have a democracy that, again, is still inheriting the kind of consequences of a slave economy and also being an imperial power around the world. At the time that I was there was heavy bombing going on in Bosnia. And I was thinking about what happens as American culture leaches out. And so what I wanted to do is take the building as an image. And so what you're looking at here is when you're inside, there's a glass wall that we built in front of it. I don't have a good photograph with me of that whole extension of that, but it was about 14 feet high, and it stretched across the whole facade of the building. So it both liquefied and blurred the view in, just as it blurred the view out. And the kind of aspect of that is one that I thought very much about as a kind of state of mind. So here you see the blurred, and this is the gridded wall that you either looked out to the Giardini, to the park, through, or back in at the building. And inside, rather than thinking about filling it with objects, what I did was begin by opening up the building and opening up the skylight that had been covered over for, 30 years or something. And they'd always been dark, for a long time, dark interior gallery-lit spaces. And so we opened the skylights, and I wanted to leave them empty and to let that emptiness in some way stand in for a story that can't be told by or carried by this kind of architecture. And so what we did, we installed soffits, or installed into the building really an auger system. So it's an agriculture system for carrying flour or carrying some particulate matter, and we sifted around the edges pink, really toxic colored, artificially colored plastic resin that was a really fine powder. It was so fine, it was a little bit like smoke, and it was perfectly round in its particle size. So if you reached your hand out, it didn't actually stick. But if you reach through, what was on the other side and what was being graced by this powder and its sometimes turbulence was, was the Braille. And this is a translation of Charles Resnikoff's writing at the turn of, in the 30s, from court records 100 years previous to the time that I was in Venice. And it's a document that's an accounting of property violence and racial violence in America, and it's divided geographically. And to think about where do these stories go, where do these get embedded physically in this kind of space was one of my questions. Braille, interestingly, like the spoken code that became the oral part of this piece, is actually, in its early origins, was military in its basis. And that's partly why I used that form. We had all of his volumes translated. And the other thing about his writing, and I wish I had some of it here to read to you, but I don't know if I'd encourage you to go read it. It's the kind of writing that's an accounting. It just lists acts, and it lists kind of facts. And it does it in a descriptively poetic way, but it's about how acts have consequences. And so the writing, when you read it, is incredibly visceral, just as this powder was, as it really leached out of the pavilion and found its way trailed all over Venice, and was marked by people coming in, writing in the powder, and in fact marked everything, as it left. And so it was this piece that was in perpetual descent, and it leached, it leaked, it was uncomfortable, and in some ways it was sometimes there and sometimes not there, depending on the weather and the number of people in it. So it was a presence that was shifting constantly. And, I don't have more slides. And it made me really actually turn my work a lot. It was not very well received. And I think there were several tirades against this piece in the press, or nothing. And I had always gone from being in the piece, like when I was a figure in the piece or someone was standing in as an attendant with or for me, standing in such a way that you could enter from the side or from behind the person. And so you could kind of join the activity. That was the insinuation. And this piece, even though it didn't have a figure in it, made me, I think, in my work, turn and think about face-to-face relationships and to kind of figure out a way to engage perhaps more directly the voice of the politics that was in some ways generating this work. So it seems like all of these, when I started, I've never kind of put things together in this order, but when I started to look at these pieces, all of these pieces that I think have, in their origins, been motivated by complicated historic events, they've all been places of where there's water, and the location where I'm working is on the water. And this is another one of those. This is a project I did in Tara, Japan, and this is a location, it's a former armament storage building that's owned by the Japanese government and rented by this gallery. And it's between an active Japanese Navy base and an active American Navy base. And where I live in Columbus and the archive that I often use at the Historical Society is one where the pilot of the Enola Gay, all of his stuff is, and he was actually from Columbus. And so I was thinking about, this was not my first project in Japan, but I was thinking about how do I, as an American, carry and re-enter that history and think about the kind of legacy of this building. And so I ended up being really drawn to the charcoal that somebody had put into my hands, which is used traditionally under wooden houses in Japan or traditionally built houses to keep them dry, because the charcoal, which is wood that no longer has water in it, will absorb the moisture. And they're almost glass-like. They, not quite, they're not vitrified, but they do make a sound when they chink together. And what we did in this is take all the walls down in this space and hang these what you're seeing the charcoal hung just above a structure that stood in the middle of the space, which is where the torpedoes used to load onto the warships. And that's, the gallery had always had this covered over and had white walls up along it. So all I did was remove all of that to kind of make present the space that was really there. And this horizon is set at such a level that when you walk in, you have to just walk a little bit under it. Like it's a physical presence, but it's also a shadow presence. This piece is called, I was trying to remember the name of it, is called The Picture is Still. And I was thinking about how all the photographs I was looking at and the research I was doing both in Japan and in the States is how no matter how many photographs I look at of that time period, this impossibility of ever re-entering that time. And so I started to use a really small video camera to kind of probe those photographs and to think about the camera as a way to, in some ways, reanimate or return time to this thing that's fixed, to body that time forth. And I ended up actually, this is the interior that we cleaned out of the kind of tarred structures where the torpedoes were originally stored and launched. And at the end of it, there are two of them, so like two eyes, two of them exactly center in the space. And I started thinking about, I looked at all of this video that I'd shot of all these historical photographs, and I couldn't settle on any one of them. And so I ended up actually videotaping a photograph of my son when he was little, and his mouth, you're seeing his eye here, but his mouth was wide open. And thinking about this gesture, which this was just before 9/11, but this space where something's happened that we have no language for, and how the, I guess almost like the reaction is to open one's mouth to something that's unsayable, and how can materials maybe be part of doing that saying. Well, I don't know if you could hear that, but he was, this was like, one's life and one's work are always really interesting, how they end up working together. The video at the beginning with the pencil that you saw, this is my son Emmett chasing me around a table for hours and hours and hours. Let's do it again. Let's do it again, Mom. And figuring out how to work around things that he was interested in. This, I got him to whistle for me. He didn't know how to whistle. Can you hear that? Let's see. And I'm describing what I'm seeing with my hand. And he was supposed to be in bed, and of course he wasn't. So, and he couldn't whistle. And this kind of quality of breath, like you can almost feel something from the inside coming up through this kind of liminal edge of the mouth to presence, and that's the sound I wanted. But I was really just trying to get him to go to sleep. And then a project this is called Appeals, and this is a project that was in Istanbul, and I was part of the Istanbul Biennial a number of years ago, and it was in a warehouse that was a customs warehouse that is often taken over for these kind of events, and it was right along the Bosphorus. So it was a place, it's this narrow little neck in the world where everything from that connects east to west passed through that. And it's a body of water that has two directions. It runs one way deep and it runs another way on the surface. And that has everything to do with the history of that land. And I started thinking about that kind of passage that's always shifting, and actually made a space that took the central kind of corridor and hung curtains that were mechanized and were constantly opening and closing, but never letting like a clear view through.
The date, the time, the place.
And what you hear is a translation. There were, I think, 36 speakers that were mounted along this, and they were taken from different human rights tribunals and the testimonies. And they are the incredible matter-of-fact language that actually describes events of real horrific historic proportion. And that actually moved around, and with this kind of moving sea of cloth. I haven't actually seen this piece in a really long time. They never sent it back. They ran out of money. This happens in some of these projects. And but there was something, there's this tension in here, and I don't know, I think photographs can be really deceiving, because there's this part of the work that's like wanting to be engulfed, and this kind of physical immersion, and this accumulation of material, and the kind of luxuriating in that mass, and in the sort of rhythms of those movement. And then there's another part of the work that is really uncomfortable and is not easy to sit with. And that's one of, I guess, those edges or borders in the work.
Record shall be signed. Record shall note the date, the time, the place.
There you can see how the speakers were mounted. And it's interesting because this work is coming forward really, I think, now to what I'm working on. And so I started to think about, say, the act of speaking, or the mouth as a site of making, and thinking about the mouth as a space. It's not a place. I mean, it's a place and it's a space, and it's not an object of our body. And it's, I think it's the first room. Maybe for me, it's the first installation. And this is an early video that was made thinking about that difficulty of coming to speech, of coming to find the words that need saying or the questions that need articulating, and how difficult it is to kind of come to form or come to words, even though we're born, simultaneously and equally into being bodily selves and articulate language selves. There, could you hear that? Could you all hear it? And sort of thinking of that more actively as actually the mouth and the interior of the mouth as a site of making led to a series of works. This is something I've been doing for, probably 10 years. And thinking about what happens when you attach one sense to another, like if using the little cameras in one's hand makes the hand an eye, what happens if the site of articulation and the site of speech and the place where we eat and ingest and gnaw and gnash, just like the ocean, thinking about that as actually an eye. And so what I did was make these very small pinhole cameras that actually can carry film and sit inside my mouth. And when my lips open, which is a first act to speaking, the view out of my lips is the thing that registers on the film. And so what happens is the time of standing face to face with another person is it's usually about 20, 30 seconds, sometimes longer, and it's a long time to stand very close to someone with your mouth open. We are not supposed to stand in public with our mouths open. Isn't that like the first thing you hear from your mother, like, close your mouth? And so it's always really interesting when these, things you're not supposed to do come forward. And this is actually my niece, Manette. And she was quite young, and my son Emmett, when I started doing this, he would say, Mom, I really hate it when you do these weird things. And then a couple of years later, my mom, she takes pictures with her mouth. But it's been an interesting kind of ongoing process. I've been doing it less, partly because it's much more difficult to travel with cameras and get them through security. But I have found it's a way to... I'm very interested in that thing that happens when you actually really look at someone very closely that you don't necessarily know, and you allow yourself to stand very still in silence. And I think more than making a portrait, what comes forward is the kind of presence of that exchange. This is actually the writer Susan Stewart, who I actually met here in La Jolla and has become a good friend, and a writer that I really respect. And then this is Coco Fusco. So two people you might know. But thinking about how then, of course, the shape of the lips is just like the shape of the eye, and what happens psychologically when you trade those spaces. It's also, I think, some of its meaning is buried in the actual language that we use to describe the eye. I think that I remember reading that the pupil actually refers to the little figure in the eye, the little puppet in the eye. And the little puppet in the eye is the person that you're standing in front of, because you can see your own self as a figure upside down in someone else's eye. And that is actually recorded in this. And then I started thinking about how acts of speech locate themselves in particular places or become meaningful or necessary because of those locations, and how might the duration of a group speaking actually determine the making, the exposure of a piece of film, and therefore the making of an image. And I did a project in Philadelphia, which is obviously a place that has a history of public speech and places of fraught public gatherings, and the institutional documents which form our government. And this is Carpenter's Hall that you see there on the right. And it's now run by the Park Department. The second drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the second congressional Congress was held here. And the table you see on your left is just an old wooden table with a Lazy Susan that I converted into a pinhole camera with multiple apertures. And it was partly in response to thinking about the history of Pennsylvania Hall, which was a public hall built in the 1830s by a group of activists to specifically house a place for public speech and to debate abolition. And it was, within 3 days of being opened, it was burned to the ground by a crowd, and it was not stopped by the constables. And so it's a place for me that kind of then haunts now all of the other public spaces that are preserved and still standing in Philadelphia. And I started to think about what kind of speaking needs to come forward. So I worked with 5 different groups of people, librarians from the public library. I worked with the curators and librarians from a private library, and several other groups. And I asked them to actually bring documents of something that they thought needed to be read in this public space. And so these readings went on why the building was open. And there was film loaded in the camera. And what it does is it actually exposes over 20 minutes to 30 minutes. And these are the images that it makes. And I'm kind of going back and going to continue this work. I find it really interesting, the process of speaking in a group. The thing that happens is a line is passed around the table, and that there are very few kind of structures that we have for participating in that kind of activity. The Declaration of Human Rights was, in this case, chosen by 3 of the groups, unbeknownst to each other. And it was a way to think about remarking a space orally. And but for me, coming to speech or making sounds or opening one's mouth, as much as I have obviously done it in my work, is still something that makes me incredibly nervous. And I think who is speaking, who is listening, what needs saying. And it's, I think, all tied up for me with the responsibility of the artist about how do you exteriorize or find form for something that forms from an interior place, and how do you articulate the liminal edge without maybe bringing the presence of language forward, but into a field, but not always a specific text. And so uttering and utterly and uttering and saying are things I'm very much thinking about. And so as I was putting this work together, I was thinking about where does that first in some places appear in the work. And this was a project I did under the silk sacrificial cloth of an orange membrane in Lyon. And this one had both the sound of the 5 peacocks that lived below the horizon of orange cloth, living in the space, and their calling. And then up the telephone pole, there was a person who was winding typewriter ribbon around their hand and shaping the negative space of the hand of making inside that carrier of impression and language, the ribbon. And above them, there was a recording of a exercise and a call and response between a vocal teacher and a student from the local music school. But it was above the light. So while the animals were very present in the space, this piece is called Mattering. To matter and to be matter. The voice that you heard was out of reach. And so it was always kind of placed in these early works at the perimeter of the architecture. And so, of course, the voice that dominates, or the sound that dominates, is of the peacocks. And when you walk into this space, the cloth, I was thinking about how do you actually make the air present in here. And so it was mechanically lifted on one end, and it would just settle. And as it settled, because it had springs at the other end, it would actually wave the air, I guess. And that's sort of wave the air. And because you were walking in underneath that horizon, you were really in the space of the birds. And so the whole way that you're aware of your own presence entering the space changes. You don't like kind of charge in. I mean, one, there's nothing on the walls to look at, but your negotiation of your presence with the birds is actually what comes to play underneath this canopy. Thinking like the teeth a lot continually about human-animal relations and how the recognition of the animal comes forward. And a little bit like Ahab, I don't know, up on the loft here. The people that were there were 3 guys that took care of this after I left France, and they all had seatbelts on when they were up on the telephone pole, because it was quite a ways up there. And that was kind of constantly present. So it's built into part of the piece. And so I start to think about how these installations are places of caregiving, caregiving. And that what keeps them alive is acts of care. So it was kind of a switch. Let's do that again. So thinking about the reciprocal acts of speaking and listening and how those find form and come forward in the work and are influencing a lot the work that I'm doing now. That was first a kind of material presence in this is very early, this is like the first video I ever shot. And the camera doesn't really move, and that's what's changed a lot in all the recent work. But this ambiguous flow of whether the liquid is falling in or coming out, which makes that edge ambiguous. And so then that speaking and listening, or that sounding and hearing, and sound or hearing is how we touch at a distance, so it's how the tactile comes forward. It really came to occupy the center of this piece that was in Stockholm, and in a 5-story former grain barn that's located in the middle of a forest. And I did all the sound recording for this on the property, and we actually made the speakers, which are Leslie speakers that have been modified and exposed and taken out of their original cabinets. We put them on hoists so they move vertically up and down through the 5 material horizons of the building. And in some ways what they do is they narrate in an abstract way the material history of the building and of the body in this building, which is a property that I think has had a long relationship to thinking about whether the forest is a place of commerce and a place of, it's a resource or it's a reserve. And that's how that's been articulated in this place has really determined the history of this place. So what happens is that the spinning Leslie speaker becomes the figure, the sound becomes the figure that now animates and occupies the work. It's much better to work for me in wood buildings because I can cut them up than in new concrete buildings, which are giving me, especially now, a harder time of things. But the work really forms by my experience of being in these places. This is a piece that I was there for 6 weeks making it. It's really made on site. It's made with local materials. The next floor up from that is a wooden floor that's been laid like a parquet floor in reference to the actually library floor in the adjacent castle. And set into that floor, which is like a dance floor in some ways, and it's just this open horizon, which has 2 of the speakers moving through it, and set into it is a spinning disc, so that you can go from moving around the building to the building in some senses moving around you. And so to step on is not to lose your border because you have to balance yourself. But I think, as I said when I was here a couple months ago, it's just enough of a dare that you have to jump on, but it doesn't actually throw you across the room. But I think it's this longing to be caught up in that whirling or that movement, which would be a loss of bodily border, that in part this speaks to.
I took the image to the summit.
And what you hear is a reading of an A.R. Emmons poem. And we could set the speakers so they went up and down at different rates, and they spun at different rates as they passed by the open windows. And then the horizons of the materials move up the body as you move up the building. So the tables move up.
With the first small cross.
And here you hear Charles, who is the person who's managing the forests of this property, Charles Wachtmeister, narrating the use of a medieval counting table, which is carved into the surfaces of these work height tables that create a whole plane across the third floor.
So many thousands must you always say. You must also know that any space means 5 times as many as the line next beneath it, to which it belongs. And the space under the first line means so that the line...
So one of the things that really generated this piece is that this property is actually the largest organic dairy at this point in this part of Europe. And so I spent all of my time when I didn't know what I was going to be doing with this piece in the barns with the animals. And my experience of being in the barns and listening to them respond to the people coming in to milk them and to my presence and this kind of communication that passes unspoken had I think a big influence on this, especially one of the young men who worked there who had not spoken for a number of years and really through his work with the animals was returned to speech. This is the next floor up, and you can see the materials rising. So now it's a series of the structural posts in the building that are wound with thread. So they're warped as if being prepared for weaving, and really textiles and thread and sewing are my very first hand. But here, rather than being crossed by another thread, they're being crossed by the movement of the speaker, which becomes the weft crossing the warp and passing through these kind of semi-transparent layers. And this is everything you hear was recorded while we were there making it and asking people to take a walk in the woods and hum to yourself, or recording the actual manual acts of making it, and then that made into a piece that changes over several hours. And at the top, you're actually ascending into chroma. You're ascending into this kind of interior bodily color that's red. And there's no material at the top except that overhead our clothing is laid above the beams. And that's the same material that's in the packages that you might have noticed on the ground. So it narrates the rise of the body actually marking itself through the building. And then the shaft, which was dark at the bottom, is light as you look back down through, where the sound arrives and recedes. Now you can see how, looking through, get a vantage of 3 floors. And let's see, how are we doing for time? I better speed up. How are you guys doing for time? All right, I'm just going to go really quickly through this. This is a piece where, again, the sound is in the center. And it's a piece called Human Carriage. It was at the Guggenheim last year, and it's in the rotunda, and it has everything to do with the piece in some ways that Shahrokh is going to show you. It was an incredible thing to have the chance to actually work in this Frank Lloyd Wright space. Initially, they had asked if I would like to work in one of the galleries, and it's in a show that was looking at the influence of Asia on artists in New York and the West up to a certain period, and I was asked to actually respond to the exhibition and the thesis of the exhibition, which is how this occurred through the translation of texts. And when they asked me if I wanted to occupy one of the smaller galleries, I think I hesitated. I was like one shouldn't really be picky at the Guggenheim, but I really love volume, and I love how we feel our space, our bodily interior, how we feel the experience of being in large volumes. And so I sort of said, well, there's this big space out there. Why don't we make something that passes through the whole exhibition? And I wanted to make something that would do that and do it without electronics and would do it without any mechanism. And so we made this carriage with skateboard wheels, and it carries 2 Tibetan bells down a bent pipe that follows the kind of changing radius of the Guggenheim. And let's see, I have some sound here somewhere. There we go. No? There. It was like, I don't know, it was like a ghost. It was. And true to the kind of Buddhist underpinnings of the show, of course, it never went down the same way twice. It was, it made the act of actually animating it, which if a young artist, Audra, was there for every day and every hour the show practically was open, along with 2 kind of people who gave her relief on certain days. But that it was really, the piece was all the lifetime of being in the museum, and the way that when this carriage would go down, it would call attention and people would turn towards the center. And you could probably, I think I forgot to put the sound on this, but you could hear the kids, turning towards it, and one being turned to then kind of sometimes clap for this inanimate thing that had become alive in the museum. And when it got to the bottom, the sound of the bells would knock off the counterweights in the system, which were made out of reassembled books, which referred to the many texts that influenced this exhibition. And they would drop kathud into the pool, which was dry, a dry pool. And here, I think you can see it. It didn't always work, but it, the piece is this. It's really simple. It's all these books, and they've been cut apart and remade, and it's thinking a lot about how influence occurs. It's like you never know what's going to fall out or where it's going to land, and I think that's a lot of the process of the artist, how we maybe use our reading in our libraries. But in this case, I was also thinking about the weight and the density of these texts falling in their silence, because we live at a time when we read silently. And the silence and the sound handing back and forth off to each other as they rise and fall through the rotunda of the Guggenheim. One of the I think I put in one of the consequences of having made this piece. Do I have? Yeah, these. That as I was packing up all the book weights, and it was like Santa Claus shop making these. It was a lot of hand labor and a lot of work, which is actually, I always feel like the reward in a project. It's when a real other kind of thinking kicks in. But we started scanning these onto the scanner in the studio before we were shipping them off, and we realized each of them is in some ways like those erased book, a portraiture of the kind of time of their making, and that each one is different, and it's made through a process not of kind of visual design, but of kind of unself-conscious tactile manipulating of these materials. So these I've been recently making into prints. And so the last piece I'm going to show, really, before we get to the tower, is the sort of horizontal version of the last structure. And this is a project I've been in and out of Luang Prabang in Laos for the last 5 years. And last year gifted this boat, which you see the keel of, a steel boat with a wooden top, which was built as a walking meditation chamber temple boat for the Mekong, and is now parked at just south of Luang Prabang at Pau, and is part of a Buddhist community there where the monk that I worked with, Satuang Keo, lives, and is trying to run a school and establish and kind of make a place for serious study and meditation practice, which has been so suppressed and really lost through generations of monks due to the obvious political history of Laos, which is has that distinct description of being the most bombed country in the world, and that is. That was where we dropped all our bombs during the Vietnam War. And thinking now, being in Luang Prabang now and seeing the incredible pressure of tourism coming into a city that has been designated as a World Heritage Site, and what that pressure brings. And it's not something, it's like the river, you cannot stop it. So how do you make a place that allows certain things to come forward and not be lost? And as an artist, kind of going to work in another culture, is there a way to think that you might do something that actually can be left there and be of some usefulness and make a context for something to happen, rather than be something that you take away and it circulates in another place and time? And so it was a long process of making this boat, and it was a way, though, that I found a connection, I think, ultimately back to the textile hand, because it's a cloth culture, and everywhere there is cloth. And the shuttle that actually carries the weft that crosses the warp is, as you can see here, sitting on the loom. It's a boat shuttle. And so thinking about how a cloth is built in a culture and all the crossing of threads and the metaphors that extend from that, and thinking about the figure in the boat being related to that weaving is something that came for me together in this project. You can see here the river on the left and some of the structures that inspired this. There were 3 in ruin and 1 restored across the other side of the Mekong in the forest, which is where traditionally the different monastic communities would go on retreat. And they're just really beautiful spaces because they're like the size of a single body, with your hands out and your height. And so when I approached Satu for making this boat, he was starting these meditation retreats and really feeling the pressure of the change in the peninsula there. And he thought it was very funny to make a place to be still on water that's moving. And but that's what we did. And here he's showing us that, us Westerners don't have any sense of what scale this should actually be. This is the man that built the keel and found us the second-hand motor that actually powers it and then drove it. You see the Laos flag and the Buddhist flag there on the front of the boat. I don't know what's happened to all my sound here, but it was built so that it arched over your head, and the wooden louvers would move, and they could close, so it could be closed, or it could be open, or it could be in any degree. And it was just wide enough for 2 figures, and it became used by the nuns, and it's been used by the novices, and I think I have some of those, but This little bit of footage is my kind of understanding that my hand back to weaving might not literally be to weave something, but to think about how the figure weaves across light and space, and how that's actually structuring the work. I think I have some of the pictures of the blessing of this boat. Here it is on the Mekong. I think for me it was the experience of living in a place in a Buddhist culture where the morning offerings in the street are quite strong, and even though you have tourists really kind of attacking those with cameras, but thinking about what kind of cultural imagination is made if the last thing you do when you go to bed is prepare rice for an offering the next morning, and that offering kind of brackets your day. These were the nuns that I traveled with on retreat. They were very funny. They were really great. And they're like, why do these louvers look like prison? It looks like bars in here. You know, I was thinking it was very beautiful. And they were giving me a hard time. And then I just really want to show, this is the final gifting. This is the little dock they made for it. And this is the reading where it's really becoming a temple. This is Satuankeo. And I think this tells you a lot about the different cultures. Here you see how many pages are there in the document that Satu was signing. Those are the documents, the legal documents from New York that allowed me to gift this boat to the Sangha. And this is the piece of paper that the Sangha made. So I had this like 15-page, really complicated legal thing, and this was the Buddhist receipt. And then we borrowed the boat one last time, and the novices were using it and taking it up the Mekong. And I had always wanted this boat of silence to be tethered to a boat of sound. And so the court musicians that had actually played in the palace and whose music had also been suppressed, we, through an anthropologist that has been living there for, 20 years, a long time, he knew these guys and asked if they would come sing for the boat and serenade the boat. And so my last, about just actually a year ago, when we were there, they actually serenaded it. And so this 5 years of muddy riverbanks, building this thing that became, it's like I think when people begin to renovate a house and they always say, if I knew what I was getting into, that's what the curator kept telling me. If I knew what we were getting into to make this project. But of course then, in the end, it's all for this ephemeral moment. But it was a very complicated thing to give the gift away and to make the space for the gift to be received and to really walk away from it. And I had to negotiate with Satu for several years for it to be the right time to be accepting, and he thought that we had conditions for it. He thought it should. We believe that it should only be used for walking meditation. And I'm like, no, you can sleep on it, you can read on it, you can take trips on it. It's really, really can have multiple uses. And he gave me a lecture, and he said, Anne, a gift is not a gift if it has conditions. And I was like, okay, I get it, but I think it has a lot to do also with art and the way that art circulates, in culture. And it needs to circulate within that kind of understanding of what a gift is. And it only amplifies as it can freely move. So the last thing is the tower and the opening of the mouth to light became architecture in this space, which is north of San Francisco. And I didn't put the piece in today, but when I was here in March talking to some of the theater students, I showed pictures of the 3 sheep that I had borrowed from this property, which led to the making of the building 15 years later of this project. It's the only thing I've really ever built. It's in a property that's been private, that's been gifted recently to a foundation and will be endowed and become a public site. And it has a series of sculptures. There's a really great Bruce Nauman staircase piece that goes or travels across the landscape. Martin Poirier, Ursula von Rydensvard. There's a number of artists, but there's not infinite number of spaces. And as I was working with Steve, I was thinking about how do you make something that can have multiple lives, that might be used and make a condition for something else to happen, and not just fill up more space. But it did become, in the end, the largest object on the property. And it's almost 90-foot tower that's about 25 feet in diameter, and it has a couple of feet of water at the bottom that reflects the sky. It's open. It's like an open donut, and it's kind of mute on the outside. It really is not extraordinary looking in any way. It's in a draw on the land that rises to meet the horizon. And it has 2 double helical staircases in it, and those rise from either side, so that I was thinking a lot, kind of after my working a little bit with some people in the theater, about the condition of this face-to-face relationship in the theater, and what would happen if you made a space where the relationship between the audience and the performer was vertically wound. And so they were wound within each other. And what movements might be possible, what kind of structures of performance might be possible. And so I'm working with Steve Oliver to really kind of commission work for it. The way each of these projects is made public is a fundraiser for another arts organization. And it can hold about 120 people. 120 people. And it opened. One of the things you'll see here, I think I have some video, and as I really thought about it as a place for calling across the landscape. And Meredith Monk opened it, and this is from that. Theo Bleckman. And Meredith playing the shruti at the bottom of the well, and that sound coming up. And making this thing that's about connecting the ground and the sky. But before I show you, or have Shahrokh show you the project he did there, I just want to show you how people get into the tower. Because it tells you a lot about Steve, that 3/4 of the way through the building process, I arrived and I decided that the doorways at the bottom of the tower had to go. That this formal threshold to the inside was wrong, and that we needed to return the land to its more original contour and topography, and that I wanted to take the openings that were there to let light come in through these shafts to the inside, actually become the doorway, and so that you would enter into this horizontally. So it's like a vocal cord for the ranch that you actually have to bend and enter, just as you had to bend and walk under those charcoals in Japan. And what happens as you ascend towards light is that each of the stairs is like a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch shorter in its distance from the wall than the one before it. So there's this real slow compression against the exterior walls as you actually gain light. And so there's kind of that sort of opposite physical experience to what's actually happening in the space. There, let's see. Oh, you know what? I just want to show you how it can be very graceful entering from the side. Where is it? Meow. There. But I think it's something about what happens is that threshold and then that walking in, you're wound, you can be wound through the performers or musicians in this case and in the most recent projects. But, you know, we're very Western in that we can see that stair we can't quite get to, and everybody keeps going up because they keep thinking they can get to a staircase on the other side that they can't actually get to. So there, I was just really lucky when I made that decision that there were two of these light wells and they were right across from each other. So it's almost like that way when you're making something, you're preparing for something you don't know yet. And if you're really lucky, these are the kind of accidents that occur. And the process or the practice of work, I think, is to make the condition for those things to happen, you know, for the things that you don't know need to happen or you can't articulate, but somehow you do know, but they have to rise to attention. This is just a few stills from the project. Meredith opened the project, but then it was with existing compositions, and we asked her to come back and do a piece that was more specifically a response to the space. And that's this piece, Songs of Ascension. And watching them carry these instruments and move and play at the same time was really quite a feat. And I'm quite interested in kind of expanding the way the tower can be used as an instrument, but also as a space. I'm working now with someone who's going to climb and hang rope, that we're going to put ropes in it, and there are going to be things going on inside as well as outside. And so Meredith worked with the Pacific Mozart Ensemble, and they were at the top of the tower. And there's something, it seems very odd to make this very medieval and ancient form in this time. But I'm really thinking about how does it make perhaps performance or music or an experience possible that isn't possible in other kinds of architectural contexts. This is from a Joe Good piece, and he worked with the, Joe is a choreographer in the Bay Area, and he worked with the girls' chorus. And then the dancers actually used the railings to kind of fly on, which was a little bit unnerving, I have to say. I think it's in this footage. Let's see. Here they go. It sort of looks like something out of Harry Potter, doesn't it? It is really. So, and then there was a project. I'm not gonna. We're running out of time, so go into depth on any of these. But Kronos, who was came up and visited the tower and wanted to do something there, used it as an opportunity to support their young composer series and to work with Supanga, who's a Javanese composer who was writing for the first time and notating for Western instruments. We don't really have full video of this yet. So, one of the things that David Harrington said as a consequence of having spent time in this space is that there were a few pieces of music that he wanted to come back and record there, that it was the perfect space for certain compositions. So I think that's kind of in the offing. And I'm actually going to ask you to put the other projector on. And I want to ask Shahrokh to come up and talk about the piece he did there last summer, because I think you really approached it in a really different way than any of these other projects in terms of how you conceived of the space and used it as an instrument and brought in electronics. And the whole timing of this project relative to events in the world made it an incredibly kind of moving experience for me. And who knows what the next project is, but will you come up, Shahrokh? Yeah. Do you need a computer?
No.
Okay.
Just to contextualize the piece, which was done in last July, the first time, originally the piece was an installation that was at the Magnus Museum in Berkeley. And Larry Rinder curated the piece, which was about multiculturalism and about tolerance. And it was a celebration of thinking about music as a way of worship. And Larry approached me and told me, said that possibly we could do this on at the Anne Hamilton's Tower. And I had known Anne Hamilton of, as I said, making ephemeral structures, and we go see this tower that we think is going to stay there for thousands of years. And the moment I walked in there, the first thing that came to me was that this is a sacred place, but I didn't find a God. It's like, it's a place that really spoke with you. It was a place that the moment you walk in there, you really hear. I mean, I heard so much of the acoustics as I was, and as you walk up, the acoustics keep changing. At every level, you hear a different sound. And it's, as Anne mentioned, it is a place that is very different for performance. It's really wonderful to have your audience so close to you, and also to have this idea of spatialization all around the tower. So what I thought was actually to bring in a lot of electronics, and Meyer Sounds collaborated with us, and we had 16 channels of speakers in there, and in the end, when we counted, we had about over a mile of wire in the tower. And so I wanted to use spatialization very strongly and create a sense of movement in the space. And what happened was the piece was to be performed in July, and in June, the elections in Iran happened. Originally, the piece was supposed to be a very celebrative piece, ending in some sense in an ecstasy. But beginning middle of June, I was glued to the TV, looking at the images coming from Iran and what was happening in Iran, and a number of the performers that you see in this piece are from Iran, and I just had to respond to this. So what you will see now is an 8-minute excerpt of the documentation, which was shot and edited by Tara Knight, is from the climax of the piece towards the end. And this climax in this form actually originally was not supposed to be as part of this piece. And we encountered many interesting problems. Like, one of them was like, when we had set up all the locations and the violinist arrived, and I had set him to be at the top, and I saw him like walking just with his back towards the back wall and not wanting to get close. And he was just standing and says, I can't play here. Like, this is too high. And you actually do get, like, you feel like this is very high. And then the singer also, Siamak Shajarian, was like, he said later on, he said, I don't know why I'm holding this microphone so strongly. But in the end, when we finished, almost everybody said it, and we had a number of people from UCSD among us that was part of this project. Everybody said this was really felt like a dream. And why I have come to accept that is that I feel like the tower talks to our unconscious. I mean, we kept walking up and down, going. We don't know where we're going, but you know there's light up there. You walk up there, and then you see this really fantastic view, and the sound is just something that we're not used to as you walk in there. So you will hear a multi-channel version of this documentation. In some sense, you will hear all the instruments in front, but when you were in the tower, you actually heard each instrument in a different location, and we had set up all the delays so that you would have a very distinct idea, even though there were electronics and amplification. We had set it up so that you would feel a very distinct localization of every instrument. But you will hear a little bit of the acoustics. One thing to say that there is no artificial reverb in this clip that you will hear. It's all the reverberation that you hear is the reverberation that comes from the tower itself. So can we hear it?
I wanted to ask Shahrokh to come up and talk about the poem, the poetry in this. And then I'm happy, or I think both of us are happy to take questions. But there, I think, is also an announcement, right? Okay.
The two poems were, the first one was written earlier, right around the revolution, the 1979 revolution, at the time that there was a lot of excitement about what would happen in Iran. And the later one was written. The first one was by Siavash Kasrai. The second one, which is called Lullaby for Being Awake, was written later on when the mullahs basically took over Iran. And it was just, as I said, these were not part of the original piece, and they were added basically in the last 2 weeks to structure of it, the playing of it, and really what at that time all of us were so affected by what was happening that everybody had their heart in this, and somehow some people say that eruptions, the sense of the eruption that you hear in the piece was about what was happening at that time. And one point I wanted to thank Cal IT2 and Department of Theater and Dance to make this possible. And after the reception, after the question and answer, there is a reception which I hope you will be coming, which has been sponsored by the gallery at Cal IT2, which I also like to thank them. But I think we should open to questions and answers, which...
We can ask all the questions outside, or if anyone is has a burning one. Shahrokh, thank you for showing that very much. Yeah. I mean, I think the works are all tactile in different ways. I think they're sensory. Certainly the tower is not easily accessible, except that we did a test with somebody, who is, at least there, needs a wheelchair, and how to get them in and get them in the tower. So, but it's not it's certainly not an ADA space. But I think that the work... I'm sure I assume a certain mobility. That's probably true, and I haven't really thought a lot about it. But I think that the work is also sensory in ways that doesn't communicate with the photographs. And it's like each of us have really different kinds of experiences in these works. And it's really, these pieces are really not, to me, they're more experiences than they are images. But, that's hard to kind of carry forward into this. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, that means we get to go have a glass of wine. All right, thank you.